Hey, welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev. Each episode we're going to read about 30 minutes of a history book. We are reading chapter 20 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Kind of where I chose the title of this YouTube channel. Yes, indeed. Remember, if you like what you're hearing, hit that like and subscribe button and the notification bell. And let's dig in. With Gerald Ford in office, the long continuity in American policy was maintained. He continued Nixon's policy of aid to the Saigon regime, apparently still hoping that the two government would remain stable. The head of a congressional committee, John Calkins, visiting South Vietnam just around the time of Nixon's fall from office, reported, "The South Vietnamese army shows every sign of being an effective and spirited security force. Oil exploration will begin very soon. Tourism can be encouraged by continued security of scenic and historic areas and by the erection of a new Hyatt hotel. South Vietnam needs foreign investment to finance these and other developments. She has a large labor pool of talented, industrious people whose cost of labor is far less than Hong Kong, Singapore, or even Korea or Taiwan. I also feel there is much profit to be made here. The combination of serving both God and Mammon had proved attractive to Americans and others in the past. Vietnam could be the next takeoff capitalistic showplace in Asia." It's always about the profit in it. In the spring of 1975, everything that radical critics of American policy in Vietnam had been saying, that without American troops, the Saigon government's lack of popular support would be revealed, came true. An offensive by North Vietnamese troops, left in the South by terms of the 1973 truce, swept through town after town. Ford continued to be optimistic. He was the last of a long line of government officials and journalists who promised victory. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, February 19th, 1963, "Victory is in sight." General William Westmoreland, November 15th, 1967, "I have never been more encouraged in my 4 years in Vietnam." Columnist Joseph Alsop, November 1st, 1972, "Hanoi has accepted near total defeat." On April 16th, 1975, Ford said, "I am absolutely convinced if Congress made available $722 million in military assistance by the time I asked, or sometime shortly thereafter, the South Vietnamese could stabilize the military situation in Vietnam today." 2 weeks later, April 29th, 1975, the North Vietnamese moved into Saigon and the war was over. Most of the establishment had already, despite Ford and a few stalwarts, given up on Vietnam. What they worried about was the readiness of the American public now to support other military actions overseas. There were trouble signs in the months before the defeat in Vietnam. In early 1975, Senator John C. Culver of Iowa was unhappy that Americans would not fight for Korea. He said that Vietnam had taken a mighty toll on the national will of the American people. Shortly before that, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, speaking to the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies, was reported as being generally gloomy, saying that the world no longer regarded American military power as awesome. In March 1975, a Catholic organization making a survey of American attitudes on abortion learned other things. To the statement, "The people running this country, government, political, church, and civic leaders, don't tell us the truth." More than 83% agreed. New York Times international correspondent C.L. Sulzberger, a consistent supporter of government Cold War foreign policy, wrote in a troubled mood in early 1975 from Ankara, Turkey, that the glow was worn off from the era of the Truman Doctrine, when military aid was given to Greece and Turkey. He added, and one cannot say that the bleak outlook here is balanced by any brilliant United States successes in Greece, where a vast mob recently battered the United States Embassy. He concluded, there must be something seriously wrong with the way we present ourselves these days. The problem, according to Sulzberger, was not the United States behavior, but the way this behavior was presented to the world. It was a few months after these reports, in April 1975, that Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, invited to be commencement speaker at the University of Michigan, was faced with petitions protesting the invitation because of Kissinger's role in the Vietnam War. Also, a counter-commencement program was planned. He withdrew. It was a low time for the administration. Vietnam was lost. The very words supposed it was ours to lose. Kissinger was quoted that April by Washington Post columnist Tom Braden, the U.S. must carry out some act somewhere in the world which shows its determination to continue to be a world power. The following month came the Mayaguez affair. The Mayaguez was an American cargo ship sailing from South Vietnam to Thailand in May 1975, just 3 weeks after the victory of the revolutionary forces in Vietnam. When it came close to an island in Cambodia, where a revolutionary regime had just taken power, the ship was stopped by the Cambodians, taken to a port at a nearby island, and the crew removed to the mainland. The crew later described their treatment as courteous. A man who spoke English greeted us with a handshake and welcomed us to Cambodia. The press reported, Captain Miller and his men all say they were never abused by their captors. There were even accounts of kind treatment of Cambodian soldiers, feeding them first and eating what the Americans left. Of the soldiers giving the seamen the mattresses off their beds, but the Cambodians did ask the crew about spying in the CIA. President Ford sent a message to the Cambodian government to release the ship and crew, and when 36 hours had elapsed and there was no response, the message had been given to the Chinese liaison mission in Washington, but was returned the next day, ostensibly undelivered. One press account said, he began military operations. U.S. planes bombed Cambodian ships. They strafed the very boat that was taking the American soldiers to the mainland. The men had been detained on a Monday morning. On Wednesday evening, the Cambodians released them, putting them on a fishing boat headed for the American fleet. That afternoon, knowing the seamen had been taken off Tang Island, Ford nevertheless ordered a marine assault on Tang Island. That assault began about 7:15 Wednesday evening, but an hour earlier, the crewmen were already headed back to the American fleet. About 7 o'clock p.m., the release had been announced on the radio in Bangkok. Indeed, the boat carrying the returned crewmen was spotted by a U.S. reconnaissance plane that signaled them. Not mentioned in any press account at the time, or in any government statement, was a fact that emerged in October 1976, when the General Accounting Office made a report on the Mayaguez affair. The U.S. had received a message from a Chinese diplomat saying China was using its influence with Cambodia on the ship and expected it to be released soon. This message was received 14 hours before the marine assault began. No American soldier was hurt by the Cambodians. The Marines invading Tang Island, however, met expectedly unexpectedly tough resistance, and of 200 invaders, 1/3 were soon dead or wounded. This exceeded the casualty rate in the World War II invasion of Iwo Jima. 5 of 11 helicopters in the invasion force were blown up or disabled. Also, 23 Americans were killed in a helicopter crash over Thailand on their way to participate in the action, the fact that the government tried to keep secret. Altogether, 41 Americans were killed in the military actions ordered by Ford. There were 39 sailors on the Mayaguez. Why the rush to bomb, strafe, attack? Why even the ship and crew were recovered? Did Ford order American planes to bomb the Cambodian mainland with untold Cambodian casualties? What could justify such a combination of moral blindness and military bungling? The answer to this came soon. It was necessary to show the world that giant America, defeated by tiny Vietnam, was still powerful and resolute. The New York Times reported on May 16, 1975, American officials, including Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, were said to have been eager to find some dramatic means of underscoring President Ford's stated intention to maintain our leadership on a worldwide basis. The occasion came with the capture of the vessel. Administration officials made it clear that they welcomed the opportunity. Another press dispatch from Washington in the midst of the Mayaguez events said high-ranking sources familiar with military strategy and planning said privately that the seizure of the vessel might provide the test of American determination in Southeast Asia that they asserted the U.S. had been seeking since the collapse of Allied governments in South Vietnam and Cambodia. Columnist James Reston wrote, "In fact, the administration almost seems grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate that the president can act quickly. Officials here have been bridling over a host of silly taunts about the American paper tiger and hope the Marines have answered the charge." It was not surprising that Secretary of Defense Schlesinger called it a very successful operation, done for purposes that were necessary for the well-being of this society. But why would the prestigious Times columnist James Reston, a strong critic of Nixon and Watergate, call the Mayaguez operation melodramatic and successful? And why would the New York Times, which had criticized the Vietnam War, talk about the admirable efficiency of the operation? What seemed to be happening was that the establishment, Republicans, Democrats, newspapers, television, was closing ranks behind Ford and Kissinger and behind the idea that American authority must be asserted everywhere in the world. Congress at this time behaved much as it had done in the early years of the Vietnam War, like a flock of sheep. Back in 1973, in a mood of fatigue and disgust with the Vietnam War, Congress had passed a War Powers Act that required the President, before taking military action, to consult with Congress. In the Mayaguez affair, Ford ignored this. He had several aides make phone calls to 18 congressmen to inform them that military action was underway. But as I.F. Stone said, he was the maverick journalist who published the anti-establishment I.F. Stone's Weekly. Congress raped as easily as it did in the Tonkin Gulf affair. Congress raped as easily as it did in the Tonkin Gulf affair. Congressman Robert Dridden of Massachusetts was an exception. Senator McGovern, Nixon's presidential opponent in 1972 and longtime anti-war critic, opposed the action. So did Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin. Senator Edward Brooke raised questions. Senator Edward Kennedy did not speak out, nor did other senators who during the Vietnam War had influenced Congress to ban further military action in Indochina. but now said their own legislation did not apply. Secretary of State Kissinger would say, we are forced into this. When Kissinger was asked why the U.S. was risking the lives of the Mayagez seamen by firing on ships in the area without knowing where they were, he called it a necessary risk. Kissinger also said the incident ought to make clear that there are limits beyond which the United States cannot be pushed. That the United States is prepared to defend those interests and that it can get public support and congressional support for these actions. Indeed, congressmen, Democrats as well as Republicans, who had been critical of the Vietnam War, now seemed anxious to pull things together in a unified show of strength to the rest of the world. A week before the Mayagez affair, 2 weeks before Saigon fell, 56 congressmen had signed a statement saying, "Let no nation read the events in Indochina as the failure of the American will." One of them was a black congressman from Georgia, Andrew Young. It was a complex process of consolidation that the system undertook in 1975. It included old-type military actions like the Mayagez affair to assert authority in the world and at home. There was also a need to satisfy a disillusioned public that the system was criticizing and correcting itself. The standard way was to conduct publicized investigations that found specific culprits but left the system intact. Watergate had made both the FBI and the CIA look bad, breaking the laws they were sworn to uphold, cooperating with Nixon in his burglary jobs and illegal wiretapping. In 1975, congressional committees in the House and Senate began investigations of the FBI and CIA. The CIA inquiry disclosed that the CIA had gone beyond its original mission of gathering intelligence and was conducting secret operations of all kinds. For instance, back in the 1950s, it had administered the drug LSD to unsuspecting Americans to test its effects. One American scientist, given such a dose by a CIA agent, leaped from a New York hotel window to his death. Holy crap. Excuse me. The CIA had also been involved in assassination plots against Castro of Cuba and other heads of state. It had introduced African swine fever virus into Cuba in 1971, bringing disease and then slaughter to 500,000 pigs. A CIA operative told a reporter he delivered the virus from an army base in the Canal Zone to anti-Castro Cubans. You talk about this stuff and people think you're just a conspiracy theorist and you just believe all the hype. But then you find out, what the government has actually done, what the CIA has actually done. There's a quote, and I can't remember who said it, but it was like, no matter what conspiracy theories you can imagine, what the government is actually doing is worse. It was also learned from the investigation that the CIA, with the collusion of a secret committee of 40 headed by Henry Kissinger, had worked to destabilize the Chilean government headed by Salvador Allende, a Marxist who had been elected president in one of the rare free elections in Latin America. ITT, with large interests in Chile, played a part in this operation. When in 1974 the American ambassador in Chile, David Popper, suggested to the Chilean junta, which with U.S. aid had overthrown Allende, that they were violating human rights, he was rebuked by Kissinger, who sent word, "Tell Popper to cut out the political science lectures." The investigation of the FBI disclosed many years of illegal actions to disrupt and destroy radical groups and left-wing groups of all kinds. The FBI had sent forged letters, engaged in burglaries, and admitted to 92 between 1960 and 1966. 92 burglaries in 6 years. opened mail illegally, and in the case of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, seems to have conspired in murder. Valuable information came out of the investigations, but it was just enough and in just the right way. Moderate press coverage, little television coverage, thick books of reports with limited readership to give the impression of an honest society correcting itself. The investigations themselves revealed the limits of government willingness to probe into such activities. The Church Committee, set up by the Senate, conducted its investigations with the cooperation of the agencies being investigated, and indeed submitted its findings on the CIA to the CIA to see if there was material that the agency wanted omitted. Wasn't that awful? That's so awful. Thus, while there was much valuable material in the report, there is no way of knowing how much more there was. The final report was a compromise between committee diligence and CIA caution. The Pike Committee, set up in the House of Representatives, made no such agreement with the CIA or FBI, and when it issued its final report, the same House that had authorized its investigation voted to keep the report secret. When the report was leaked via a CBS newscaster, Daniel Shore, to the Village Voice in New York, it was never printed by the important newspapers in the country, the Times, the Washington Post, or others. Shore was suspended by CBS. It was another instance of cooperation between the mass media and the government in instances of national security. The Church Committee, in its report of CIA attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro and other foreign leaders, revealed an interesting point of view. The committee seemed to look on the killing of a head of state as an unpardonable violation of some gentleman's agreement among statesmen, much more deplorable than military interventions that killed ordinary people. The committee wrote in the introduction to its assassination report, "Once methods of coercion and violence are chosen, the probability of loss of life is always present. There is, however, a significant difference between a cold-blooded, targeted, intentional killing of an individual foreign leader and other forms of intervening in the affairs of foreign nations." The Church Committee uncovered CIA operations to secretly influence the minds of Americans. I'm not sure who's being quoted, but this is the report. The CIA is now using several hundred American academics, administrators, faculty members, graduate students engaged in teaching, who, in addition to providing leads and on occasion making introductions for intelligence purposes, write books and other material to be used for propaganda purposes abroad. These academics are located in over 100 American colleges, universities, and related institutions. At the majority of institutions, no one other than the individual concerned is aware of the CIA link. At the others, at least one university official is aware of the operational use of academics on his campus. The CIA considers these operational relationships within the U.S. academic community as perhaps its most sensitive domestic area and has strict controls governing these operations. In 1961, the chief of the CIA's Covert Action Staff wrote that books were the most important weapon of strategic propaganda. The Church Committee found that more than 1,000 books were produced, subsidized, or sponsored by the CIA before the end of 1967. And you'd be surprised how many of the shows and movies that you watch today are sponsored and helped by the American military establishment, the CIA, the FBI, and they are guiding the stories, if you know what I mean. When Kissinger testified before the Church Committee about the bombing of Laos, orchestrated by the CIA as a secret activity, he said, "I do not believe in retrospect that it was a good national policy to have the CIA conduct the war in Laos. I think we should have found some other way of doing it." There was no indication that anyone on the committee challenged this idea, that what was done should have been done, but by another method. Thus, in 1974 and 1975, the system was acting to purge the country of its rascals and restore it to a healthy, or at least to an acceptable, state. The resignation of Nixon, the succession of Ford, the exposure of bad deeds by the FBI and CIA, all aimed to regain the badly damaged confidence of the American people. However, even with these strenuous efforts, there were still many signs in the American public of suspicion, even hostility, to the leaders of government, military, big business. 2 months after the end of the Vietnam War, only 20% of Americans polled thought the collapse of the Saigon government was a threat to the United States security. June 14, 1975 was Flag Day. We don't celebrate Flag Day anymore, do we? June 4th, 1975 was Flag Day, and President Gerald Ford spoke at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the Army staged a march symbolizing its involvement in 13 wars. Ford commented that he was glad to see so many flags, but a reporter covering the event wrote, "Actually, there were few American flags to be seen near the president's reviewing stand. One held aloft by demonstrators bore an inked-in inscription saying, 'No more genocide in our name.' It was torn down by spectators as the neighbors applauded." That July, the Lou Harris poll, looking at the public's confidence in the government from 1966 to 75, reported that confidence in the military during that period had dropped from 62% to 29%, in business from 55% to 18%, in both President and Congress from 42% to 13%. Shortly after that, another Harris poll reported 65% of Americans oppose military aid abroad because they feel it allows dictatorships to maintain control over their population. Perhaps much of the general dissatisfaction was due to the economic state of most Americans. Inflation and unemployment had been rising steadily since 1973, which was the year when, according to a Harris poll, the number of Americans feeling alienated and disaffected with the general state of the country climbed from 29% in 1966, to over 50%. After Ford succeeded Nixon, the percentage of alienated was 55%. The survey showed that people were troubled most of all by inflation. In the fall of 1975, excuse me, sorry. How many of you are yawning? Because I just yawned. Sorry about that. In the fall of 1975, a New York Times survey of 1,559 persons and interviews with 60 families in 12 cities showed a substantial decline in optimism about the future. The Times reported inflation, the apparent inability of the country to solve its economic problems, and a foreboding that the energy crisis will mean a permanent step backward for the nation's standard of living, have made inroads into Americans' confidence, expectations, and aspirations. Pessimism about the future is particularly acute among those who earn less than $7,000 annually. But remember, $7,000 annually meant something different in 75 than it does now. Now that's not, oh wow. But it is also high within families whose annual incomes range from $10,000 to $15,000, which also, you got to keep in mind, that was more money then. There is also concern that No longer will hard work and a conscientious effort to save money bring them a nice home in the suburbs. Well, that came true. Even higher income people, the survey found, are not as optimistic as they were in past years, indicating that discontent is moving up from the lower middle income to higher economic levels. Around the same time, the fall of 1975, public opinion analysis testifying before a congressional committee reported, according to the New York Times, that public confidence in the government and in the country's economic future is probably lower than it has ever been since they began to measure such things scientifically. Government statistics suggested the reasons. The Census Bureau reported that from 1974 to 75, the number of Americans legally poor, that is, below an income of $5,500, had risen 10% and was now 25.9 million people. Also, the unemployment rate, which had been 5.6% in 1974, had risen to 8.3% in 1975, and the number of people who exhausted their unemployment benefits increased from 2 million in 1974 to 4.3 million in 1975. Sorry. Government figures, however, generally underestimated the amount of poverty, set the legally poor level too low, and underestimated the amount of unemployment. For instance, if 16.6% of the population averaged 6 months of unemployment during 1975, or 33.2% averaged 3 months of unemployment, the average annual figure given by the government was 8.3%, which sounded better. In the year 1976, with the presidential election approaching, there was worry in the establishment about the public's faith in the system. William Simon, Secretary of the Treasury under both Nixon and Ford, before then an investment banker earning over $2 million a year, spoke in the fall of 1976 to a business council meeting in Hot Springs, Virginia. He said that when so much of the world is lurching towards socialism or totalitarianism, it was urgent to make the American business system understood, because private enterprise is losing by default. In many of our schools, in much of the communications media, and in growing portion of the public consciousness. His speech could well be taken to represent the thinking of the American corporate elite. Vietnam, Watergate, student unrest, shifting moral codes, the worst recession in a generation, and a number of other jarring cultural shocks have all combined to create a new climate of questions and doubt. It all adds up to a general malaise, a society-wide crisis of institutional confidence. Too often, Simon said, Americans have been taught to distrust the very word profit and the profit motive that makes up our prosperity possible. To somehow feel this system that has done more to alleviate human suffering and privation than any other is somehow cynical, selfish, and amoral. We must, Simon said, get across the human side of capitalism. And we'll end it there. Thank you for joining me. If you liked listening to me read, and I hope you did, please hit the like and subscribe button. Hit that notification bell so that you'll be notified when I release a new video, because YouTube does unsubscribe viewers. And see you next time. Thank you.